Ex-friends of a serial killer, what were they like? Charming, had lots of friends. I remember sitting on the school bus thinking I should try to be more like him. He was always smiling, and girls would flirt with him. About 8 to 10 years after that, he was arrested along with another guy his age for the burglary, rape, and murder of a very old woman and her dog. Does a mass murderer count? He was a jerk. His wife was my friend, and she started slowly telling me a few things about him. They came to our home for some gatherings we held, and he was simply often very controlling of her social life. When several of us reached out to her, she happily accepted our help to get her out of the marriage and into safety. Soon after, he showed up at my door one day demanding money, which I did not give him. He left, angry. A few months later, he was evicted from his rental in the next town over and came back into our town, hell-bent on killing everyone who helped her and who was associated with the rental situation and another circumstance that he was mad about. I was not home that night, thankfully. He hunted down and killed 5 people, one of whom was a friend of mine. He committed suicide when the police had him cornered. That was nearly 30 years ago. Andy, my friend, I still miss you and your goofy grin. I wasn't friends with him, but he wanted to be friends with me. I moved to another town when I was 10. It was a neighborhood. My neighbors were friendly, so were people on the street. My next door neighbors and the neighbor across the street, Bill. When I was 10, my house burned to the ground, and when I was crying out front with the firefighters and insurance workers, Bill approached me and talked with me. He was gentle, kind, an older man with grey silver hair and a beard to match. He told me he knew I was often alone at home because my mom works, and told me I was allowed to come over at any time. He even mentioned having games to play and movies to watch. I told him thank you. As I grew older, I didn't pay much attention to Bill. I never went over, but every day I walked home, Bill was out doing something in this lawn or garage. He had a bike and often had a younger gentleman in his 40s who visited a lot. One night Bill's packing up a huge U-Haul by 11 PM on a weekday. I was 13 then. A month or so passed. We found out from one of our neighbors that she might have done something bad. Neighbor finds Bill on America's Most Wanted. This woman is a stay-at-home mother who doesn't believe in the outside world products and stuff. Tons of free time. She said it looked exactly like him, so much so that the next time she saw him outside she told him so. She casually went up the man and told him she saw someone who looked exactly like him on America's Most Wanted. The very single next day is the day I saw them moving out at 11 PM. When I asked what the crimes were, she told me, looking sick, that he and his brother have been kidnapping young girls, raping them, and milling and throwing them out as they move separately or together to find another spot. They've been wanted for decades. Not a serial killer, but I went to school with the guy that murdered Chris Kyle, American Sniper, and Chad Littlefield. He was a pretty normal kid, kinda funny, had ADD I believe, and was in some of the academic assistance programs, if I can remember right. Class clown type for the most part. Don't remember him getting into a bunch of fights or anything. Nothing specific really stands out. His mom was one of our teachers in elementary. He left school early and joined the military. Did a couple tours, including the Haitian disaster relief in the early 2010s. Apparently fishing bodies out of wreckage is what messed him up really bad. After that he had horrible PTSD and developed some bad mental health issues. Chris and Chad were doing a range therapy business for veterans. Eddie snapped and murdered him for his truck, big modified diesel, and took off. Horrible story and outcome from someone who was once pretty normal. I knew him from 3rd grade or so until senior year. Not great friends or anything, but he seemed like a decent guy. We'd been out of school for about 10 years or so when it happened, so a lot changed over that time, I'm sure. I worked with a guy who killed his wife and drove her car through a few states with her body in the back. It was in SUV, and their youngest son in the front. I live in Texas. He got caught in Ohio after his wife was reported missing, and they tracked her car via the OnStar system. They found him at a woman's house he apparently met online. A fight ensued, and he got arrested just before the police opened the trunk and found his wife. He and I were on a small team of 6 people training for the new job we got hired on at, so I'd think I knew him well enough. Used to eat lunch together sometimes, and I would joke with him about how much he worked out because the dude was just completely jacked. He talked about how he and his wife moved to our city from a number of hours away because she got some position she couldn't get where they lived. She was a specialized nurse of some kind. He talked about how much he loved her and always showed pictures of their youngest child together. To me he seemed like a good dad that wanted to give the world to his family. Then I guess they started fighting after a few months of being here. He would come in slightly late, stare at the wall with a deadpan expression, and wouldn't lighten up or talk to anybody until lunch. I took it as he just stopped being a morning person, but he talked to me and another teammate about the fights he had with his wife. Then the fights got worse. She kicked him out at one point, and he was living out of his car, working out at the gym in our office at work, and showering there as well. In the morning he'd often stare at the keyboard of his computer and wouldn't respond to anyone's jokes or comments. Walker and I bought him lunch one day and he opened up to us. He told us that his wife threatened to take his son away and that he'd never see him again, and said, "I swear, I'll kill or die before that happens." And of course, we thought nothing of it. It's the kind of thing people just say, you know? After this talk, we set up a group text where we'd share memes and bullshit videos. The last text I got from him was him telling us he needed to get out and asking us to get drinks or something with him. Both of us were busy that day, so we couldn't. Next day back at work, he isn't there. 2 more days pass, nothing. I ask our trainer if he's heard anything, as he wasn't responding to texts, and the trainer gave me a look and said he couldn't discuss it. I found out what happened when I googled his name. Not me, but my old boss used to babysit Carla Homolka for several years before she was old enough to not need a babysitter, but she would still come over to her house and hang out with her kids all the time. She said she was a sweet girl and that her kids were very close friends with her. She also knew Paul Bernardo because of Carla, but she never mentioned him much other than she believed he brainwashed her into aiding him with all the murders. Played D&D with a guy on deployment for a few months while I was in the Navy. We hung out in the same group of people. I stopped playing because he kept trying to rape all the female NPCs/player characters. When we got back from deployment, the FBI and NSIS were pierside waiting for him. Him and some other guys had raped and killed a woman whose husband was on deployment. Also had some friends who tied up an old man who they suspected of molesting one's younger brother when we were teenagers. They tortured him for hours, then killed him, and tried to burn the body. 2 got life, the other turned evidence and only served a few years. Had another guy I was pretty good friends with get arrested by ATF for trying to blow up the car of our local adder. He bought fake C4 from an undercover agent. They swarmed him while he was pushing the switch. As I write this, I realize I've been close to some really messed up people. Maybe I'm the one who isn't right. Not serial killer, but allegedly a serial child molester. We were friends. He was always a little off compared to the other kids, but I thought we were really good friends for a while. This was when we were quite young. Thinking back though, sadly, I think he may have been abused himself in some way by his parents. I slept over one night, and it was the weirdest experience. His dad came into the room for some reason, and he made me hide in the closet and pretend not to be there. Nothing happened, but it was a big red flag. I'm projecting a lot off of that one weird experience, but that's what I remember. Other than that, he always lived in fear of his parents, but we really just thought they were strict. In high school he seemed like your overcompensating jock type, but nothing crazy or weird. We were okay friends then but drifted apart. Then like a lot of years later I was talking to my mom and she informed me that, oh yeah, got caught molesting a bunch of kids. It was pretty fucked up, but sure enough it was in the paper. She showed me the clipping. Yeah, she's weird. Anyways, I have no idea if he ended up going to prison or whatever, and didn't really want to know. It's just sad shit either way, and I hope it really wasn't true. Not a serial killer, but I worked with a guy who killed his wife and her new boyfriend. They were separated, and then himself. He broke into his wife's apartment. She called cops, but they didn't get there in time, and lined them up along a wall, including their kids. Didn't shoot the kids thankfully, but they witnessed this all, and were part of the lineup, probably thinking they were next. He was the world's nicest, most easygoing guy. Never had an unkind word for anyone. Hard to believe he could do something like that. I think he bottled it up inside until he just snapped. I think losing your temper and spouting off at people who deserve it once in a while is probably good for you. Don't always pretend to be happy if you're not. Someday it might be too much for you. I'm an exotic dancer, yes, a stripper, and there is this one customer in particular that I'll never be able to forget. He was very handsome, charming, successful, funny, etc. All of the girls liked him as he was super respectful and tipped us very generously, but there was always something about him that was so unnerving to me. I would dread whenever he would come in and try to avoid him as much as possible, but for some reason he was interested in me the most. He came in for months at a time and would talk to me. Again, seemed normal enough, but there was just something. All the other dancers loved him and nobody could understand the issue I had with him. He also always asked me out on dates outside of the club, to which I made excuses as to why I could not. Then one night, when he came into my workplace, he bought a VIP room with me, and things were pretty normal up until he looked very seriously at me and asked me if he could tell me his secret sexual fantasy. I said sure, to which he replied that he had a fantasy of r*ping/torturing/murdering a girl while his significant other watches. I straight up walked out and told management. He left and never came back. I have no doubt in my mind that this man is in fact a serial killer, but is just under the radar. The creepiest part to me is how he was constantly wanting to meet me outside my workplace too. Was he trying to get me to watch his crimes or do them on me? I'm not sure. Glad I didn't find out. He was like a big goofy brother. I loved him to bits, but fell out of contact with him when I split with my ex. Last year his ex, we were friends through him, sent me an article via FB Messenger detailing how he murdered his new wife and her 3 young kids and set the trailer they were all living in on fire. The pictures of him in the article chilled me to the bone. The guy I knew back then wasn't there. There was just a cold-blooded emptiness in his eyes. He's still waiting to be put on trial. Was roommates with one. He was a cool guy. Serial killer in the sense that he was born in crime and killed multiple people in his career. He went to multiple prisons in multiple countries. He made a 180 and bettered his life in the way that he sits at home, watches TV all day and enjoys cooking. I was in a dark place during that time, and him being able to better his life was a huge motivation to change my life for the better. Cool guy. Last I heard he was still on the right path. I still think about him sometimes, only wish him the best. Obligatory not a serial killer. It was somewhat high profile in the US, so I don't want to go into too many details. Ex-friend helped to kill a teenage girl. Honestly, she was like any other person with seemingly normal mental health issues. I knew she had depression, but a lot of people do and don't kill people. She was a high achiever in school and her extracurriculars. She had loving parents and a fluffy dog. She was goofy and had a naivete about her. The freaky thing is that I sat next to her in psych class, learning about all these abnormal disorders, and I thought that I'd never meet anyone who had them, and it turned out she was a future murderer. She later got diagnosed with a number of psychological disorders. One of my professors, Mr. Anderson, sat near Ted Bundy in a college course due to the proximity of their last names in alphabetical order. My grandmother-in-law had a store next to a serial killer from Montana. Can't remember his name now, but in both cases the people said they were just nice as could be. No suspicion of being a killer at all. That's what scares me the most. They aren't the weird quiet kid. They're the charming funny guys. Really great dad. When I was little I wished he was *my* dad. Dirt poor, but always took time. Took us sledding when it snowed. Backyard barbecues. Took us fishing at the river once, and we found these big old turtles. Beautiful. Probably ancient. And we ran to tell him. He came over with a machete and chopped their heads off. Made a game of it. With his 6-year-old boys helping pull the head out and laughing. I was pretty traumatized by that incident. But other than that, he was just a guy. Liked drinking and fireworks. Getting high. He was a little bit drug-addled, maybe very mildly retarded. There was a murder, and not long after they picked him up for it. And while he was in jail, awaiting trial, he confessed to a bunch of other stuff. Other murders, dozens of rapes. I'm not convinced he did them all. He definitely did the last one, but the rest, I sometimes wonder if they didn't get him to confess because he just wasn't very smart and was probably easy to manipulate. It was national news. His family had a hard time shaking the stigma, so I don't want to be too detailed. I feel like I owe it to them to let that time in our lives be forgotten. My mom used to work with Dana Sugre and was friends with her. My mom didn't know her middle name was Sue until the murders. BTW. My mom really liked her, but she was very materialistic. Whenever I saw her she was very friendly and would talk to me about Ren and Stimpy as I was 9 and obsessed the cartoon at the time. What was really weird was that we lived in a decent sized city, but one of her victims that lived and later helped her, Dorinda Hawkins, was our next door neighbor. There was no other connection she had to Dorinda, and she strangled her in a storefront downtown. The Dark Knight killer who shot up the theater in Colorado grew up right behind my aunt's house in San Diego. She would frequently babysit the kids in her neighborhood. This was mid-90s to early 2000s. I'd come over a lot to visit my cousins. There were always lots of kids over playing, usually older than me, and he was one of them. He went to high school and college with my cousins as well, but I personally only ever met him as a very young child and I can't personally remember any interactions. My one cousin however did know him as a normal, extremely intelligent person, very interested in the brain and science. Come college he was so invested in his studies they grew apart and eventually moved away, cutting all contact. Wish I knew more or had more to say. All I remember is being in the backyard playing with the dogs by the pool, being rambunctious little ones, never thinking one day down the road that kid would dye his hair orange and be a murderer. He was so sweet. He was basically my childhood friend. Then one day I stopped hearing from him. 1 or 2 years later he called me and asked me out. I said yes and was so happy. I really did love him. On the way to the restaurant someone hit my car and I wasn't able to go. A week later, the day before I was supposed to meet him, he got arrested for having 3 bodies of prostitutes that had recently went missing, stored in his basement. All of them severely damaged and beaten.